This is a video presentation of Bible 2114, Bible Survey, Unit number 13, entitled The United Monarchy. The assignment for this unit is to read pages 226 through 262 and 286 through 296 in the text Erdman's Handbook to the Bible, and the books of Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1 Kings chapters 1 through 11. After viewing this presentation, the student should be able to answer questions on the purpose of the book of Ruth, the place of Samuel in Israelite history, the conflict between theocracy, God rule, and the kingship or Samuel versus Saul, the conflict between Saul and David, the rise of the kingdom, David the soldier, the decline of the kingdom, Solomon the politician, and the purpose of the visit of the Queen of Sheba. Your speaker today is Dr. Roy Hayden.
Again, in this lecture, we will be hitting high points in events and trying to analyze developments. Fortunately, the text does an excellent job of summary and includes some very useful articles and charts, particularly the Old Testament and the Ancient Near East, pages 228 to 230, using the Bible in archaeology, page 259, and a chart of the kings of Israel and Judah, pages 284 to 285. The chart will not be necessary in this unit, since only 3 kings are discussed, Saul, David, and Solomon. But in subsequent units, you will want to constantly refer to this chart. In the last unit, we pointed out that the people of Israel were still organized in tribes. Frequently, to defend themselves, 2 or more tribes joined forces for a united effort. There was no king at that time in Israel, says the book of Judges, and then adds an evaluative statement. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. The author, of course, felt that conditions were chaotic, and the presence of a king would solve this problem. In this unit, we shall take a look at this conflict. The book of Ruth and the first part of the book called Samuel are still a part of the period of the Judges. The story of Ruth is an interesting piece of literature in its own right. Ruth was a Moabite woman who returned to Israel with her widowed mother-in-law. She herself was a widow. She had been converted to the faith of Israel and the worship of Yahweh. Levirate marriage is central to the book, and the concept of kinsman-redeemer is also prominent. But the real purpose of the book is to lay the groundwork for David. The genealogy at the end of the book tells the real story. This, then, is the family line of Perez, who is the son of Judah. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. But much happened before David was king. The people were still whirling around in their cycle of sin, punishment, repentance, and restoration. A boy was born to a woman who had prayed long and hard that she would have a child. Her rival, another wife of her husband, had several children, and every year when they went to Shiloh to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts, she was reminded of this fact. She prayed that if God would grant her a son, she in turn would give him back to the Lord for service. God granted her request, and Samuel was born. After he was weaned, which probably meant when he was old enough to care for himself, she presented him to Eli, the priest, at the temple in Shiloh. The Ark of the Covenant was then in Shiloh. Samuel grew up in this environment and gradually established himself as a prophet. God specifically called Samuel and told him what he was going to do to the family of Eli, that the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, would die on the same day. This would be a sign that judgment had come from the Lord. During a battle with the Philistines, the Israelites decided that the only way they could win was to bring the Ark of the Covenant into the battle. This was tantamount to forcing Yahweh into battle for them. However, the Philistines, who were encamped at Aphek, shown here, won anyway. The two sons of Eli were killed, and the ark was captured. Eli fell backwards from his seat when he heard that the ark had been captured, and died. The wife of Phinehas gave birth to a child and named him Ichabod. Where is the glory? Meaning that the glory had departed from Israel, for the ark of God had been captured. The Philistines took the ark to Ashdod and placed it in the temple of their god Dagon. Dagon fell down and broke to pieces. A plague came upon the inhabitants of Ashdod, so the ark was taken to Gath, perhaps this site. Again there was a plague. Ekron didn't want the ark, nor did any other of the Philistine cities. It was sent back to Israel with an offering of 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice. The ark was first at Beth Shemesh, shown here, where several men were killed because they looked into the ark. Then the ark was sent to Kiryat Yearim, where it stayed until David took it to Jerusalem. Samuel became the dominant person in the nation of Israel. He organized several successful campaigns against the Philistines, the most significant of which was at Mizpah. He had gathered Israel there to renew the covenant. The Philistines attacked. Samuel prayed, and God thundered. The Philistines were routed. Cities that had been taken by the Philistines were restored, and there was also peace with the Amorites. Samuel went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and back home to Ramah. In this way, he administered justice to Israel. The people, however, were disillusioned with the sons of Samuel, Joel and Abijah, who were judges in Beersheba. They asked for a king. Samuel prayed, and God told him, "Hearken to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds which they have done to me from the day I brought them out of Egypt even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, hearken to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them, and show them the ways of the king who shall rule over them." The ways of a king had been known in the Canaanite kingdoms for centuries, and a tablet discovered at Ugarit also gives the same 4 exactions that Samuel said a king would enforce. He would draft his subjects for military service and for the manufacture of arms. He would use men and women as forced labor in the fields and in the palace. He would take a tithe of the agricultural produce and of the cattle, and he would expropriate private property for the benefit of those in authority. In spite of Samuel's warning, the people demanded a king, and Saul was selected. It seems that there are different traditions contained in the Bible, and Saul is selected in more than one way. Chapter 9 tells how God selected Saul. In 10, verses 17 through 24, Saul was selected by Lot. But the most convincing choice was after he had successfully led a campaign against the Ammonites and rescued the city of Jabesh in Gilead. Saul was the type of king depicted in Homer's, in the Odyssey. He owned land and worked that land in time of peace. In time of war, he led the army. A very simple palace or fortress was excavated at Gibeah of Saul. The place is now called Tel El Ful, the Hill of the Bean, and the unfinished palace of King Hussein is on the top. Saul had much success against the Philistines and other enemies. His son Jonathan was an outstanding warrior and a very close friend of David. On one occasion, described in 1 Samuel 14, Jonathan decided to go over to where the Philistines were. There was a rocky crag on the one side and a rocky crag on the other side. One crag rose on the north in front of Michmash, and the other on the south in front of Geba. This is that pass with the crags on either side. Jonathan and his assistant climbed up this cliff and defeated the Philistines at the top. From my own experience of climbing this hill, I must say that Jonathan was in excellent physical shape, or it was simply a miracle. Saul had two main problems during his reign. One problem was David, but the other was himself. He found it difficult to obey God's orders. Samuel commissioned Saul to liquidate the Amalekites, including everything that belonged to them. Saul defeated the Amalekites, but he spared Agag, their king, and the best of the sheep, oxen, fatlings, and lambs. When confronted by Samuel and accused of not carrying out the Lord's command, Saul argued that the people had saved the best of the animals to sacrifice to God. Samuel answered, "Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord?" On another occasion, when Saul was going to war with the Philistines, Samuel commanded him to wait until he came to offer sacrifice. Saul waited the 7 days, the time appointed by Samuel, but Samuel did not come. The people began to scatter, so Saul took it upon himself to offer the sacrifice. By this act, he intruded into the priest's office. Saul was rejected as king, and in his place, David was anointed by Samuel. This was done secretly, however. Again, there seems to be two different traditions concerning David's relationship to Saul. Chapter 16 describes David as a skilled musician who was able to play the lyre when Saul was having a fit of depression, and by his music, he helped Saul. Chapter 17 tells of David's exploits against the Philistine giant Goliath. The Philistines were encamped between Soko and Azekah. Israel was in the valley of Elah. This duel between two combatants was a common method of fighting battles. Each side chose a champion. The two would fight and thus determine the outcome of the battle. David made use of a slingshot, a fairly long-range weapon. Then, too, God was on his side. The giant was defeated, and the victory was won for Israel. David became a prominent military leader for Saul. Unfortunately, folk songs began to appear telling of David's accomplishments. He was even compared to Saul. Saul had killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Envy and jealousy turned Saul into a dangerous person. He attempted to kill David in the palace, and when that failed, he pursued David on several occasions. This map shows the wanderings of David. David left Gibeah of Saul in the upper center, went north to Ramah, then south to Nob. Realizing that it was dangerous to stay in Israel, David went west to Gath. Next he fled eastward to the cave of Adullam, to Masada, a stronghold on the shore of the Dead Sea, and then to Keilah. The priest Abiathar joined him at Keilah, and by inquiring of the Lord, David determined that the men of Keilah planned to betray him to Saul. So he left Keilah and went to the wilderness, then to En-Gedi, back to Masada, the wilderness of Gath. Then the king of Gath gave him the town of Ziklag, and David served him as a vassal of the Philistine king. David had been forced by Saul's action to flee from territory controlled by Saul. This experience of being a fugitive and leading a band of malcontents prepared David for his later wars. He became intimate with the Philistines and their tactics. He constantly sent reports to Achish, the king of Gath, that he was making raids against the territory of Israel. But in reality, David made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. When the Philistines planned a campaign against the Israelites, David was informed by Achish that he was to go with him in the army. However, the other Philistine leaders did not trust David, so he was dismissed and did not have to fight against Saul. The Philistines again gathered at Aphek and then marched north to Jezreel. The Israelites were defeated, and Saul and his sons died on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines took the bodies and fastened them to the wall of Beit Shan, but the men of Jabesh Gilead went by night and retrieved the bodies. They took them to Jabesh and burned them there. Note that this was a Greek practice reserved for the burial of heroes. Soon after the death of Saul, David went to Hebron, this ancient city which we have seen so many times in biblical history. And the men of Judah came and anointed David king over them. The northern tribes followed a son of Saul by the name of Ishbaal. He was given the derogatory name of Ishbosheth, which means man of shame, because of the original Baal or Baal as part of his name. Two rival leaders meant civil war in Israel. Two military leaders also played a very important part in the events immediately following Saul's death. It was Abner, commander of Saul's army, that had made Ishbosheth king. Joab, son of Zeruiah, led the forces of David. The two armies met at Gibeon, one on one side of a pool and the other on the other side of the pool. There is a very large water system that has been excavated at Gibeon, but it is unlikely the pool mentioned in connection with this event. It was more of a cistern or a tunnel to get down to the water rather than a pool. A trial by champions was tried to settle the dispute between the two armies, but it was unsuccessful because there were no clear winners. 12 men from each side were chosen. Each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so they fell down together. Thus a general battle followed in which Abner killed Asahel, a brother of Joab. Later, Abner and Ishbosheth quarreled. Abner decided to turn the kingdom over to David, and he went to David at Hebron for this purpose. Joab learned that Abner had come, so he sent for him and killed him at the gate of the city. This was to avenge the death of his brother Asahel. Joab was cold, hard, and ambitious. Yet he was one who understood David better than anyone else, and his actions are usually done with David in mind. He was a cousin of David's, and a person so powerful that David took no action against him during his lifetime. Ishbosheth himself was later killed by two of his men. They took his head and presented it to David at Hebron. They expected to be rewarded for their efforts, but they got justice instead. This, however, did lead to the crowning of David king over Israel as well as Judah. He had reigned at Hebron for 7 years. The city of Jerusalem had never been taken and occupied by any of the tribes. David attacked Jerusalem and took it. He made it his new capital. Since it had not belonged to any of the tribes, it became the personal property of David. Thus, it could technically be called the city of David. The city was crown property. To this city, David brought the Ark of the Covenant. From a military viewpoint, the reign of David was outstanding. The Philistines were defeated and subdued. He also had victories over the Moabites, the king of Zobah, the Syrians, Edomites, and the Ammonites. 2 Samuel 8, verses 15 through 18, sums it up well. So David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. And Joab, the son of Zeruiah, was over the army, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Ahilud, was recorder. And Zadok, the son of Ahibub, and Ahimelech, the son of Abiathar, were priests. And Zariah was secretary. And Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, was over the Kerethites and the Pelethites. And David's sons were priests. From a moral standpoint, the reign of David left much to be desired. David had adulterous relations with Bathsheba, and when he failed to cover this up, he had her husband killed, and he took her for his own wife. Because of this sin of David's, much distress came to his family. His son Amnon committed incest with his half-sister Tamar, the sister of Absalom. Absalom killed Amnon. Later, Absalom led a rebellion against his father, and he would have succeeded if he had listened to Ahithophel instead of Hushai. Read about it in chapter 16 and 17 of 2 Samuel. Absalom was killed by Joab. As a father, David was poor. He indulged his children, but there is little indication that he really understood them. The greatest attribute to David is that he was a man after God's own heart. This had nothing to do with his exploits, either good or bad, but it refers to his character. David was open before God. He sinned, but when he realized he had sinned, he immediately repented and got back in the grace of God. It is to the Psalms that one must go to really see the depth of David's character. Read the Psalm in 2 Samuel 22. By the end of David's reign, the kingdom stretched from the brook of Egypt to the Euphrates. This was the territory promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. When David was too old to function as king, one of his sons, Adonijah, with the aid of Joab and Abiathar, the priest, went to the spring of Ein-Rogel to proclaim himself king. Nathan the prophet and Bathsheba went to King David to have Solomon designated as king. And they won. Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah, commander of the mercenary troops, were ordered to take Solomon to the spring of Gihon and anoint him king. The closing words of David are interesting. He charged Solomon to follow the law of God, kill Joab, show gratitude to the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, and kill Shammai. All these Solomon carried out. Joab was killed as he clung to the horns of the altar in the sanctuary. Shammai was executed when he broke his oath and crossed the brook Kidron. Adonijah, Solomon's rival, was also executed when he asked to marry Abishag the Shunammite. Abiathar the priest was banished because he had assisted Adonijah. The reign of Solomon is characterized by wealth and wisdom. Wisdom was the ability to govern and rule his people well. It seemed to have little bearing on his personal decisions, which eventually brought the kingdom to ruin. Solomon entered into many political alliances, a good number of them involving marriages. This may account for many of his 700 wives, and in addition to these, he had 300 concubines. These women were a detriment to Solomon, for when he was old, they turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not wholly true to the Lord his God, as was the heart of David his father. There is a hill today called the Hill of Offense. This is just southeast of Jerusalem. Here, it is believed, Solomon built high places and altars for his wives. He worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites, Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon is probably best remembered for the building of the temple in Jerusalem. This was perhaps the high point in his reign. It is described in 1 Kings chapters 5 and 6. It took 7 years to build, but his own house took 13 years. The prayer of dedication for the temple, 1 Kings 8, is a model prayer. Most of the conceivable circumstances are included. God is universal and cannot be contained in the temple. The taking of an oath in the name of God will be judged righteously. The cry of the repentant heart will be heard. When famine occurs or other calamity and the people turn to God, God will hear. When a foreigner prays to God, God will hear him also. Solomon was also a great builder of fortifications. 3 cities were fortified with what is now called a Solomonic gate. This is the gate at Gezer. Note that there are towers on the outside and 3 compartments or rooms on either side on the inside. Similar gates were found at Megiddo and at Hatzor. It seems that the same plans were used for all three building projects. The Queen of Sheba visited Solomon according to 1 Kings 10. Her main purpose was trade at the international level. She came with camels, spices, gold, and precious stones. In exchange for these, Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba all that she desired, which probably consisted of commercial goods such as horses and chariots or manufactured goods. The Queen was at the southern end of the international trade route for spices and other exotic goods, and she was dependent on the goodwill of Solomon, who controlled the northern end of that same route. She was amazed at Solomon's wisdom and wealth, but she had not visited him for that purpose. Solomon's building programs and luxuriant living standard led to problems in his kingdom. He levied forced labor to build the temple, his own house, and the Milo, the wall of Jerusalem, Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, Lower Beth-horon, Baalat, and Tamar, and many store cities. He made slaves of all the non-Israelites left in the land, and his own people were made to do work that they normally would not be required to do. This demand of labor, together with the importation of foreign gods and worship, mainly connected with his wives, brought a warning from God. Since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and will give it to your servant. Gradually, various men began to eat away at the kingdom of Solomon. Hadad in Edom, Rezon in Damascus, and Jeroboam in Israel itself. The kingdom was divided after the death of Solomon, but it was Solomon who was responsible. In this lecture, we have said that the book of Ruth was concerned with the background of David. Samuel had a great influence in Israel and can be considered the last of the judges. Saul was the first king, but he was a failure. David expanded the kingdom to its greatest physical extent and is described as a man after God's own heart. Solomon became king of an established kingdom, but because he failed to use the wisdom granted him, he brought the kingdom to the brink of ruin. The Queen of Sheba visited Solomon for commercial reasons.
This has been a video presentation of Bible Survey, Unit number 13, entitled The United Monarchy. This program has been produced by the Department of Educational Media of Oral Roberts University.